I guess I don't need to ask why focus matters. If you loaded this video, you're probably looking for answers to why sometimes you miss focus. When it comes to street photography, there are many ways to focus. You can use autofocus, you can use zone focusing, you can try to focus manually, or do a little bit of everything. Today, we will go through the most common focusing technique and see which one works the best. And the truth is, no focusing method is perfect. That's why there are so many debates around which one is the best one. This is going to be a long video, so there will be chapters in the bottom, and you can skip to the parts that interest you. But I do think it's necessary to watch it all to get clear understanding about focusing. So let's start with autofocus. Autofocus systems has become insanely good in the recent 3 years. Though some brands are doing better than others, not going to call any names here. Still, there are a few nuances with autofocus systems that you should consider. It's important to understand that even the smartest camera cannot decide on its own what exactly to focus on. You still need to direct it to what is important to you. With simple words, you need to point the camera to a specific area or spot in the frame to focus. It's not going to figure that by itself. In newer cameras, you can adjust the size of the focusing areas and move through many potential focus points across the frame. The latest autofocusing system can recognize cars, animals, birds, and of course people, and automatically focus straight into their eyes. But it's still your job to tell the camera which person to focus on. And sometimes, if there are too many people in the frame, or everyone is wearing sunglasses, the camera can get confused. So you need to help it. Now, if you're shooting a slow or static scene, you almost always get good focus. You will figure it out. It's just easier. Easier for you and for the autofocus system of the camera to deal with slow moving scenes. The problem starts to emerge in changing situations, when there's a lot of objects, when many of them are moving, when everything overlaps in layers. In those moments, the question becomes, who exactly should the camera focus on? And how do you decide that quickly? Let's go through the autofocus methods that we usually find in our cameras and see which one to use in what situation. We'll go from the most basic and older ones to the newest and most advanced ones. So the first one will be spot focusing. Spot focusing is an autofocus mode available on most cameras. When you select spot focusing, the camera uses a single, very small focus point to determine the area of sharpness. Only the subject or part of the scene directly under the selected spot will be prioritized for focusing. The nice thing is that you can move that focus point around the frame until it's exactly where you intended. You can usually move this focus point with the help of a button or a joystick, or just by using your LCD screen. Let's look at some of the benefits of working that way. Why would we use spot focusing? We will mostly use it if we want to have a pinpoint accuracy, and it offers the most precise control over exactly where the area of sharpness will be. It's ideal to isolate a very specific detail in our framing. We will use it when we want to make sure that the camera autofocus system will not focus on the background or any other objects, especially when your subject is small or surrounded by any other elements that the camera autofocus might automatically or normally prioritize. Spot focusing is essential if you are using a shallow depth of field. When shooting with very shallow depth of field, with apertures of 1.2 or even lower, focusing on someone's eye, for example, or a nail from a short distance, we will need to kind of pinpoint exactly where we want that focusing to be. Spot focusing is the preferred method when accuracy is essential. For example, when focusing on something very small or partially obstructed, like a person behind a curtain, fence, or an object reflected in a mirror. In these situations, other autofocus methods may fail to lock on the subject correctly, but with spot focusing, you can target that small spot and just nail it. But there are a few things to consider with spot focusing that are making it less effective. The first one is that it can be kind of slow and not very good for fast-moving environment. Imagine how is it to keep a small focus point directly on a moving subject, let's say a running dog. It's challenging to track that running dog through the frame with a small focus point. So in this kind of situation, we'll prefer using some other focusing methods. We will speak about them soon. The second one is that it requires careful placement. You need to be very deliberate and accurate with the focus point positioning. A little bit misalignment will lead to missed focus. I will give you an example. Let's say you're walking on the street and you have your system set on a single focus point. Suddenly, you see a girl with umbrella passing. You quickly raise your camera and attempt to focus on her. But since your focus point was not in the right place, you're focusing on something on behind. And as a result, the girl is out of focus. This is probably the most common mistake photographers do. They focus on something else because they didn't notice where the focus point is in the first place. Tell me if it happened to you. And I'm kind of curious to hear, are you using spot focusing or you're doing it all out of focus? What is your method? Write me down in the comments. Now, the next method that I want to speak about is area focusing. In newer camera models, that small spot can be increased in size to become a bigger one and even by the size of a third or half of the frame. Every camera manufacturer has its own name for it. Canon calls it zone autofocus, Nikon calls it dynamic area autofocus, Sony calls it wide area autofocus. I think Fujifilm also calls it zone. Anyways, think of it as now you're telling your camera to prioritize a focus in a certain region in your frame rather than just one small point. This comes in very handy if you want to use only one side of the frame for focusing. For example, we're fishing in some place, and the way we build our composition is with the mindset that we will have an object entering the frame on one of the sides. We will set the focusing area to that desired side and just wait for someone to get into our frame. The main pro of using area for focusing is generally easier to initially lock focus on a subject that isn't perfectly positioned under a single spot focus point. It's a good idea to use area focusing coupled with continuous autofocus. That way, once the subject is being picked up by the focusing system, it can be followed through the whole frame. It is much easier tracking a subject moving in a selected zone compared to a single focus point, right? We were speaking about the dog earlier. Kind of gives you a good balance of control and speed compared to fully automatic modes. Now let's touch on the downsides of area focusing. Well, the first one is that it is less precise. If single point gives you 100% of accuracy, zone is, let's say, 80. So now it is up to you to decide. Are you looking for precise focus but with higher chance missing it entirely, or less precise but with higher chance hitting, let's say, this 80%? The next downside is you have less pinpoint control over the exact point where the focusing will occur. If with spot focusing you can tell where exactly you want to focus, here the camera makes the final decision. Still within the selected area, but working that way is always a chance of focusing on the wrong subject, especially if there are multiple elements in that area. The camera might just decide and lock on something that you didn't intend in the first place. While the benefits of focusing that way are clear, the downsides are that the camera will identify what it believes to be a primary subject within that area. Hint, it might be a little bit different than what you had in mind. It might be the closest object, it might be a face, or an area with the most significant contrast. That method works well with elements already in the frame, but not so good with elements that are entering the frame right now. For example, a cyclist that enters our frame and gets out in a matter of seconds, by the time the camera understands that he is our primary subject, if we intended to capture him here, the camera might acquire focus only when he reaches to that spot. Or by the time that the camera decided that he is our main focus, he is already out of the frame. But overall, it will probably depend on the model of camera that you have. Some cameras will do that job very well, others might miss that cyclist altogether. This is probably my preferred autofocus method overall. I use it until I see that the results are not as planned, then I will switch to something else, to one of the other methods. And if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing. I do give a lot of tips on a regular basis, just like this one. Now let's speak about full autofocusing. I put it last because it's the least trustworthy autofocus method. This is where you give the camera the decision for everything, and I personally don't like that. It's the most automated autofocus mode your camera offers. In this mode, you give up control over focus point selection to the camera itself. The camera's autofocus systems analyze the entire frame. It looks to various cues to determine what the subject is. Based on its analysis, the camera automatically selects one or more focus points that it determines to be our primary subjects. But this is absolutely up to the camera. It might be completely different than what you intended. While on paper, that sounds very smart and you might be tempted to give up control, in reality, it is very often that the camera makes a different decision from what you had in mind. The benefits of working that way are mostly speed and convenience, and this is the ideal mode for someone who is not good friends with technology and want to focus on the process rather than playing with settings. It works well for casual shootings and situations where the subject is obvious and well separated from the background. It's good for portraits, especially when combined with face and eye detection. It is the best place to start if you're a beginner, and for that reason, it's often set as a default mode in many cameras. And overall, a good starting point for new photographers. But while it's easy, it comes with a lot of cons. The first one is lack of control where the camera focuses. It might not always choose your intended subject, especially if in complex scene with multiple elements. The camera might lock onto a background element or a less important object in the foreground, or just wrong person in a group. Full autofocus becomes less reliable in busy scenes. The camera can get confused and struggle to identify the main subject. And definitely not ideal for specific and creative uses, creative focus. If you have a specific area that you had in mind and you wanted to achieve sharp focus there, unless it's very clear seen, autofocus area is unlikely to deliver that. But when can we still get the benefit of full autofocus system? I would use it in in fast-paced action, when you're outside on a parade or you need to react quickly and you don't have time to think about focus point selection, something like mass events, carnivals, parades, or complete the opposite. You could use it with absolutely simple scenes with a simple and clear subject. When your subject is prominent and there aren't many distractions, there is a good chance that in this case the camera will nail focus accurately. It is great for portraits or shooting people, especially combined with the face and eye detection settings. And it's good for everyday snapshots and document moments without strong emphasis on precise focus control. But with all that said, the reason I almost never use it is that you can achieve 98% of the desired outcome by using area focusing. That way, you're taking all the benefits of full scene autofocusing, but just direct it on one particular area in the frame. That's how I would usually use it. I've mentioned continuous autofocus several times, but let's dive into it a little bit. When should we use single shot autofocus and when continuous one? Now, a lot of photographers, especially the ones working with Sony and Canon, which are going the best today in the autofocus department, will say, oh, just use continuous autofocus all the time. I could question that statement, but even if that can work for them, it doesn't mean that it works with all other cameras. While it might be true for some of the newer models, there are still plenty of old gear out there that needs some separation and just different approach. So single shot autofocus locks focus on your subject when you half press the shutter button, and it does not continue to adjust if the subject or the camera moves. That's it. At the moment you half press and you got a confirmation, if something changes in the scene, you will need to refocus again. We will mostly use it on static objects or just slow action when your subject is stationary and not expected to move significantly before you take the shot. This could be a person standing still or an architectural detail, or just, you can just stay and fish in some place and when you know where exactly the focusing should occur. We can use it for pre-focusing. If you want to focus on a specific point where your subject is about to pass, and then just recompose it before fully pressing the shutter. With single autofocus, the focus will remain locked on that initial point in situation where precision is the key. Another situation where I prioritize single focus would be low light. Low light or low contrast conditions in challenging lighting conditions, it's where the autofocus might struggle to lock and hunt. A deliberate single focus lock on a high contrast area or subject might be more reliable. Overall, single shot is for slow shooting, when your scene is not changing drastically. Some things to consider when you're using single shot autofocusing. Be mindful of movement. If either you or your subject moves after the focus has been confirmed, your images might be out of focus. Tracking autofocus or continuous autofocus is designed to continually adjust as your subject is moving through the frame. The best scenario to use such are where your subject is in motion, walking, running, cycling, or engaging in any activities where their distance from the camera is continuously changing. Your camera will track him and adjust the focusing distance on the fly. You will use continuous autofocus if you want to follow a subject through his movement throughout all of the frame. The key considerations for tracking autofocus are, the first one is that we need to choose the right focus area mode. We usually would need to pair the continuous autofocus with an appropriate focus area mode. A single point might be too restrictive for a moving subject, while a very wide area might look onto a lot of background elements. So you need to experiment with the size of that area to see which one works best for the type of the movement or the type of the subject you're shooting. Smooth, predictable movement is easier to track than erratic changes in direction. And don't be shy using the burst mode. Combining continuous autofocus with burst shootings allows you to capture a sequence of images as your subject moves, and later on you have more options to choose from. Now let's address some general challenges of using autofocus. While modern autofocus systems are incredibly advanced, they aren't foolproof and can present several challenges depending on the shooting situation. Here are some of the most common of them. The first one is low light. Since autofocus systems rely on detecting contrast and phase differences to find focus, in body lit environment there might not be enough light for the sensor to accurately identify these details, leading to slow focusing, focus hunting, or even failure to acquire focus altogether. The solution for that would be to use lenses with wider apertures, f1.8 or f1.4 or f1.2, to allow more light to reach the sensor. And the other one would be to utilize the camera autofocus assist lamp if it's available. I usually actually switch that one off because it draws too much attention, but in rare scenarios it might be useful to turn it on and activate it. Indeed, in low light situation, look for areas with higher contrast within the scene. You can consider the spot focusing and recompose technique. Focus on the contrasty area and then reframe to your desired composition, or switch to manual focus altogether, because this one does not require light or anything. You just adjust the distance. The other challenge is low contrast subjects. Subjects with very little surface detail or subtle tonal variation can be difficult for autofocus to lock onto. This includes plain white walls, smooth surfaces, or subjects with minimal texture. Happened to me a lot in museums, like in this photograph here. The camera really struggled to focus on the round subject that I wanted to. It happens because the autofocus system struggles again to find distinct edges or some patterns to decide what to focus on. Everything looks kind of white to it. You can solve that again, trying to focus on an edge of that area, or might find a place that has a little bit more contrast and then recompose, or temporarily placing something high contrasty and then to focus and then remove it. And then again, using manual focusing. The autofocus system can struggle with erratic or fast movement. While continuous autofocus is designed for moving subject, it can still be a struggle with very fast, unpredictable, or sudden movements. Imagine pedestrians walking both ways or moving crossroads. Who does the camera focus on? The system might lose the track on the subject or focus on another subject when you're refocusing. It happens because the camera's predictive algorithm might not accurately anticipate and understand what exactly you're trying to focus on. To solve this, try to narrow down the camera decision-making process. Basically, narrow down the focus area altogether. Instead of letting the algorithm run on all of the frame, let it find the objects in the designated area that you have pointed it to. To give yourself more chances of success, use burst mode to try and capture a frame within a sequence, or use zone focusing if you're moving subjects all pass through the same area. Another challenge for autofocus are abstractions and contrasty backgrounds. Objects in front of your independent subjects like branches, fences, glass, or busy contrasty backgrounds can confuse the autofocus systems altogether, causing it to lock on to the wrong element, to not what you intended to. The possible solution to that would be first try and position yourself in such a way to have these abstractions or contrasty areas out of the frame, or just use a small focus point, small focus area, and carefully place it exactly on your subject. If you're shooting through a glass, ensure that it's clean. If you're shooting through a fence, ensure that the focus point is penetrating between the bars. Now, all these problems were much stronger, let's say 15 years ago. Today, we're in a much better place. But if you encounter a focusing problem, see if it falls into any of these categories. Tweak the settings a little bit and you will solve that problem. Now, let's talk about the user and the common user mistakes with autofocus. A lot of photographers will half press to focus, but release the shutter several seconds later when the object changed its position or just got closer. They don't even notice that the distance was changed. Similarly, they would pre-focus and they go few steps towards the subject, but forgetting to refocus again. If you have that habit of shooting that way, there is no wonder why you're getting so many out-of-focus images. By waiting and allowing yourself or the subject to move, you are changing the distance between the camera and the subject, and focusing is optics. Once the distance has changed, you need to refocus again. I already mentioned it previously in the video that often we forget where we had our focus point initially and the results of the camera focusing on the wrong spot. Another user mistake is choosing the wrong focusing method. Incorrectly selecting autofocus mode, focus points, or not understanding how your camera autofocus system works can lead to focus errors. And from what I see on the ground with my students, the vast number of settings that you have for autofocus gets the opposite effect. Instead of making the user's life easier, it overcomplicated at the moment. Most photographers today don't know exactly how their camera autofocus algorithms work, and the camera manufacturers are doing quite a lousy job in explaining them this properly. Anyways, from the variety of options to choose from, the user usually gets overwhelmed and uses only one or two that he understands how they work. Bottom line, do the best effort to know your autofocus system and experiment until you fully understand how your camera behaves. It is crucial to understand that autofocus is not a set and forget settings. It needs to be adjusted accordingly to the situation, and many photographers are using it exactly like that. They set their autofocus once and they just use it like that through days and weeks until someone tells them, hey, you need to adjust your settings. The last challenge for the autofocusing system is the lens. Again, the lenses are significantly better in terms of autofocus and accuracy and speed than before, but if you happen to have an older or cheaper lens, you might still encounter some small challenges that come from your lens, usually in the speed department. Focusing is usually fine today. Now let's touch on the back button focusing technique. Back button focusing is a technique that a lot of street photographers use. It separates the autofocus activations from the shutter button. Instead of half pressing the shutter button to initiate focus, you assign the autofocus function to a dedicated button, usually on the back of your camera. And how does it work? First, you need to configure your camera settings to disable autofocus activation when you use the shutter button as half pressed. After you set it, to initiate focus, you press and hold the designed back button. As long as you hold that button, the camera autofocus system will be active and try to acquire or track focus. Once focus is achieved, you can release that button and camera will keep the focus locked. So as long as you or your subject don't change the distance between you, you're focused all the time. You can just fire shots without the need of refocusing. It works very well with combination with continuous autofocus. With continuous autofocus and the traditional shutter button half press, there is interesting interplay between trying to maintain focus and wanting to take the shot. So you're tracking, half pressing when you're taking the shot. But then when you're taking the shot, you have to refocus again. So between every shot when you're tracking, there's refocusing again and again. And if there are multiple subjects, the camera can focus on different objects and not the one that you intended to. Back button solves that problem because then you're tracking by pressing the back button, tracking, and you can fire the shots in between and the focusing will continue to be on the same object that you intended at the beginning. You can then fire off a series of shots by pressing the shutter button whenever the timing is right, but now without interrupting the focus tracking. It also helps you with your serious auto shooting. When shooting bursts or images on moving subject, you can keep the back button pressed and fire away. The focus will be continuously adjusted. So why is it good? Well, the first one is the separation from your shutter button. Separating focusing from shooting gives you more control over how your camera focuses. When you have them together on one button, it means that before every shot, the camera needs to refocus again. And after every shot, it needs to refocus again. But what happens if you want the camera to stay focused at a specific spot and not refocus every time? What happens if you're fishing in one spot and there are subjects coming one after the other? If the camera refocuses every single time, you will miss some of these objects. But if you pressed once on the back button focus, you refocused on that area where your subjects are passing through, then you just need to shoot. The distance does not change. You are remaining in the same area. You could pre-focus and then switch your camera to manual, but that would be too many settings. And if you use separate buttons, it makes this task significantly easier. It makes it easier to switch between single and continuous focus. To use single shot or continuous autofocusing with back button photos, you simply press and release the back button focus to lock focus on a specific subject. The focus will remain locked until you press the back button. To switch to continuous autofocus for a moving subject, just keep the back button held down. So the difference is between single shot and continuous if you're pressing one press or holding all the time. Basically you can hold all the time and have it on continuous. Back button focusing eliminates that problem. Overall, shooting that way offers a more deliberate and controlled way to manage your camera's autofocus system, especially when dealing with moving subjects and utilizing continuous autofocus. So it's a good one for street photography. It might take you some time to get used to it, but initially many photographers find that it significantly improves their focusing accuracy and efficiency once they are integrated in their shooting style. Now let's speak about zone focusing, which is a very trendy and popular approach among street photographers. Zone is a manual focusing technique that relies on understanding and utilizing the depth of field concept. Instead of actively focusing on a subject as it appears, you manually select your lens to a distance which will render a zone of sharpness which you anticipate your subject will be. Think of it like setting a trap area of focus. Anything that enters that predefined zone of sharpness has a high probability of being acceptably in focus. For zone focusing, you would usually use a wider lens, something like 24 to 35 millimeters, full frame equivalent of course, and higher aperture, something like f8, f11, f16, which will yield you just a greater depth of field, making zone focusing more forgiving. And you will try and guess the distance to your subject or the area where a subject is about to pass. The combination of your chosen aperture and the preset focus distance creates a zone in front and behind your focus points that will appear acceptably sharp. So now once you're ready and your focus and aperture are set, you can simply point and shoot when your subject enters the pre-focus zone, without needing to adjust focus for each shot. The keyword here is distance. You should maintain a similar distance to the one you set in your camera. The biggest benefit in shooting that way is speed, but it really gets time to get used to the method and deliver accurate results. You need to develop this sense of how far away common subjects tend to be in your shooting environment. Let's give you a small example of a situation that you will need to solve with zone focusing. Let's say that you want to photograph something that happens inside of a mirror. To achieve accurate focusing of what is happening inside of that mirror, you will need to add your distance to the mirror to the distance from the mirror to your subject. So if I'm 1 meter away and he is 5 meters away, the focusing system should be set at 6 meters. You're adding both of the distances together. There is nothing impossible in that, and there is not too much math to do there, but it can get challenging working with zone focusing if you all the time needed to change the distance and recalculate. I know that some photographers are sworn by this method, and with time and practice, they become extremely good at nailing the focus almost as fast as photographers who are using autofocus. Actually, the calculation of distance is something that might seem complex, but changing the settings is very straightforward, especially if you're using a lens that has good manual controls, like vintage lenses adapted or the ones from Leica or Voigtlander. So the big benefits, as I said earlier, it's speed. It's incredibly fast because you don't need to wait or autofocus or manually adjust focus for each shot. You don't need to half press the shutter to focus, which can make you less noticeable, especially in street photography. You can fire a shot from a hip in a fraction of a second. With time and experience, you will have a clear understanding of what will be in focus within your frame or what not. And there are no low light or low contrast focusing issues. Since it's manual, your only criteria for focusing are aperture, focal length, and distance. If you're going to have any problems there, it's going to be the sensor and not the focusing. But let's see where it is challenging. It requires understanding of depth of field. You need a good grasp of how aperture, focal length, and focus distance interact with each other. It's not impossible, but you need to learn it. And your accuracy depends on your distance estimations. You need to be reasonably accurate in judging distances. Now, my take on it. Zone focusing is a favorite among street photographers, period, for its speed and ability to capture candid moments quickly without looking through the viewfinder. But here's why I don't use it. I don't use zone focusing, and I know that a lot of other photographers are not using it exactly for the same reason. It's because simply I don't own a manual lens. It might sound as a silly reason, but I tried to use it with normal digital lenses, and I was not happy with it. You need to use digital scales, and a lens that just keeps turning infinitely, you always need to check the distance inside of the screen or the viewfinder, and then you kind of losing the purpose. You cannot make it a muscle memory for every focal distance change. You will need to stop, look at your screen, which takes you out of the flow and just slows you down. My idea for efficiency in photography is to make a muscle memory from most of my camera operations. But if you are adapting a lens with manual distances on the settings of the lens, with time you can develop quick responses and feeling to how much you need to turn the lens to change, for example, 1 meter between you and a subject. So I'm a big autofocus fan, and I'm trying to perfect my autofocusing technique. But if I pick up a manual lens in the future and adapt it to my own camera, I will give zone focusing a fair chance because I see a lot of sense in working that way. And I think that if you get used to it, you can be really, really good and more efficient in many ways than using autofocus. But regardless to your camera and your favorite focusing method, learn to leverage advanced focusing features that you might have there. Eye focus detection, focus confirmations, focus peaking. All these technology advancements are there for your benefit. Try to learn how to use them and ultimately find your better way to focus. I said at the beginning that there is no single best focusing method for street photography. The ideal approach often depends on your shooting style, the specific situation you are in, the type of subjects that you're photographing, and mostly your personal preferences and habits and how much you know about your camera's autofocusing abilities. Many experienced street photographers find that hybrid approach works the best. This might involve autofocus for dynamic situation and quick reactions, and switching to zone focusing when anticipating some action in specific area, or using manual when you need to penetrate some obstacles and autofocus just does not do the job. The key is to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each focusing method in your camera and practice using them in various street photography scenarios. Experiment, see what feels most intuitive and effective for you. I'm strong believer in personal experiences. I can watch many videos about swimming, but that will not teach me to swim in the same way if I actually swim. So try everything, see the results. Only personal experience will show you what works best for you. Most important is that by mastering this focusing technique and knowing when to apply each one, you will significantly increase your chances of capturing those moments that make street photography so rewarding. And I hope you learned something in this long video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next time.